The following episode depicts acts of violence and murder. Listener discretion is advised. "23-year-old Sonia Blanco and 25-year-old Evelyn Cruz are not alone. Not only will their deaths forever be connected, both women killed on February 4th, 1993. Their bodies beaten and severely bruised, both strangled to death and dumped to the curb from a vehicle. But they're among a half a dozen or so women all killed in a similar fashion over a 5-year period in Worcester. Each victim violently strangled, and each murder unsolved.
Unsolved Worcester is brought to you by the following sponsors. Follow the crowd through the doors of Donut Homies and say hi to Haley Noel, the donut queen of Worcester's Canal District. This month, the specialty donut shop features special flavors like strawberry shortcake and champagne glaze. Donut Homies is open inside the Worcester Public Market at 160 Green Street every Wednesday through Sunday at 11 a.m. Online ordering with delivery and pickup options is available at donuthomies.com. Follow Donut Homies on Facebook and Instagram for monthly menu drops, specials, and more. Donut Homies, everything sweeter with the homies.
Welcome to Unsolved Worcester. I'm your host, Dan Yeager. Today's episode is part 2 of a 2-part episode special on the murders of Sonia Blanco and Evelyn Cruz on February 4th, 1993. In today's episode, we look at possible suspects in their murders, and we look at how the murders of Sonia and Evelyn are connected to the murders of several other women in the Worcester area from the late 1980s to early 1990s. Unsolved Worcester will take a deep dive every Tuesday and Thursday into the unsolved murders and missing persons cases under investigation by Worcester Police Department's Detective Unit. We will be looking to the past, to unsolved murders as far back as the early 1950s and 60s. The approach to Unsolved Worcester is this: shine a light on each of these cases, put a life behind each victim's name, provide a timeline of events and important details, and ask questions that still need to be answered. Our goal is to remind residents of the Worcester area, both past and present, that there are dozens of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases that need resolution. We hope we can be the spark needed to solve a case. On the morning of February 4th, 1993, the body of Sonia Blanco was found on the curb in front of a multi-family home on Dick Street around 6:30 a.m. Her face had been beaten. She had 2 black eyes. About 20 minutes later, a young girl discovered the body of Evelyn Cruz on Summit Street back in 1993. Summit Street was a dark, dirty, and relatively empty street in Worcester's Canal District. Within 3 weeks after their bodies are discovered, Sonia and Evelyn's deaths are ruled homicides. Sonia had blunt force trauma to her neck. Both women died from manual strangulation. Toxicology reports show both women were on drugs when they died. Police believe they were killed, and then their bodies were later dumped in the street from a vehicle. Both women were fully clothed when their bodies were found, and medical examiners' reports indicate there were no signs of sexual assault or rape. By mid-February 1993, just a few weeks after Sonia and Evelyn's bodies were found, police were already telling reporters and the public that the murders weren't connected to the murders of 2 other women Denise Como, whose burned body was found in a boarded-up house on Austin Street in December 1992. She was strangled to death, and then her killer set her corpse on fire. And Vicky Lettinen, also strangled to death, her body discovered in a basement on Pleasant Street in early January 1993, less than a month before the bodies of Sonia and Evelyn were discovered. Detective James Gallagher told the Telegram and Gazette there wasn't anything consistent about the murders of Sonia, Evelyn, Vicky, and Denise, as well as Paulette Andrea, strangled to death in Crompton Park in September 1992. Just 4 months after Sonia and Evelyn's bodies were found in June 1993. Despite the significant similarities, police were even saying the murders of Sonia and Evelyn weren't related. While police wouldn't completely rule out a serial killer, they hadn't found any evidence that pointed to a single suspect. In the murders of Sonia and Evelyn, there was a lack of evidence at both scenes. Although police say it's unlikely, it's unclear if Sonia and Evelyn knew each other or worked the same streets. It's unknown if they were together when they were killed or if their bodies were dumped from the same vehicle. Well, police say there weren't many similarities in the deaths of Sonia Blanco, Evelyn Cruz, Vicky Lettinen, Denise Como, and Paulette Andrea. We're going to push back just a bit on their conclusion. All 3 women murdered in Worcester in 1993, Evelyn, Sonia, and Vicky, were found strangled to death over the course of just over 3 weeks' time. Paulette and Denise, whose bodies were found in September and December 1992, respectively, were also strangled to death. And while we will share Vicky and Denise's story, as well as Paulette's story, later on Unsolved Worcester, they're worth taking a brief look at now in relation to Sonia and Evelyn's murders. The bodies of the 5 women were discovered between September 1992 and February 1993, within a 3-mile radius between Elm Park and Crompton Park. 4 of the women were found just a few blocks away from Main Street. 3 of the women, Sonia, Denise, and Vicky, were discovered in the same neighborhood. The bodies of 2 others, Evelyn and Paulette, were found in Worcester's Green Island neighborhood. All 5 women were strangled to death, left with most of their clothes on, and none of the 5 were sexually assaulted or raped. 4 of the women lived in Worcester, seemingly seeing the city from the outside looking in. Sonia and Evelyn were prostitutes. Denise was homeless. Vicky was recently divorced, living in Worcester for less than a year in an apartment on Castle Street in Maine South. And there's Paulette, arguably the only woman of the 5 murdered that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was killed in Crompton Park while walking from the former Barney Google's on Washington Street. Of the 5 murders, an arrest was made in only 1. Police charged James Earl Johnson in the murder of Vicky Lettinen. Johnson was a homeless man. While a grand jury would ultimately acquit Johnson in Vicky's murder, police remained convinced Johnson was the man responsible for her death. In 2011, nearly 20 years later, DNA would connect Johnson to the murder of another woman, the 1992 strangling of Denise Como. A Season 4 episode will share Vicky and Denise's stories and the case against James Earl Johnson. Johnson lived in Worcester for 15 years, through the 1980s through the mid-1990s. So who's to say Johnson didn't kill Vicky, or even Paulette, Sonia, or Evelyn, and maybe even 17-year-old Nereda Melendez in June 1987. Nereda, whose story we shared in Season 1 of Unsolved Worcester, was also strangled to death, left with her clothes on, and had no signs of sexual assault. Unfortunately, Johnson isn't the only possible suspect in these unsolved murders. A pair of arrests made in 1994 and 1995 provides us the names of two possible suspects in the murders of Evelyn Cruz, Sonia Blanco, Denise Como, Vicky Lettinen, and Paulette Andrea. Officers in Bridgeport, Connecticut arrested Nabil Kada, a convenience store clerk, for the murder of a 24-year-old prostitute in September 1994. In similar fashion to the murders of Evelyn and Sonia, the prostitute in Bridgeport was strangled to death. Her naked body was dumped in the road in the early morning on September 2nd, 1994. Eerily enough, like in Worcester in 1992 and 1993, Bridgeport was having their own string of slain women. Between 1993 and 1994, 5 prostitutes were found strangled to death in Bridgeport. Some of the women were beaten, like in the murder of Denise Como in Worcester. One of the Bridgeport women was burned after being strangled to death. However, according to reports, despite their similarities, police couldn't find any connection between Kada and the murders in Worcester. A few months later, in April 1995, 33-year-old Christopher Fletcher was arrested in the murder of a 48-year-old Lunenburg woman. Fletcher was also a prime suspect in the 1986 murder of a 24-year-old woman in Fitchburg who had been run down by a car in Sterling and whose body was dumped under power lines in Lancaster. Worcester County District Attorney John Conti told reporters at the time that Fletcher had made statements about murders of prostitutes in Worcester in 1992 and 1993, as well as the murders of 2 other people in Lancaster. Finally, this may be a reach, but we truly believe this name is worth bringing up again. Let's not forget the man that was arrested for the murder of 17-year-old Phyllis Ann Morissette in 1968. We shared Phyllis Ann's story in episode 2 of this season, and there are too many similarities between the murder of Phyllis Ann and the murders of Evelyn Cruz, Sonia Blanco, Paulette Andrea, Denise Como, and Vicky Lettinen, as well as the 1967 murder of Sarah Cox we explored in episode 1 of this season, and the 1965 murder of Stella Brown, who was beaten, thrown from a car, and died of a broken neck, to not mention the next possible suspect. John G. Farrell was arrested and charged for the rape and strangulation of Phyllis Ann. However, he was acquitted by a grand jury. Following his acquittal, though, Farrell was held on 6 indictments of rape and assault. He would only be found guilty of just 1 count of rape in the 1967 assault of a woman at Green Hill Park. In all 6 indictments, the victims of Farrell's alleged assaults and rapes were either in a car with him or approached by him while they were alone and in a vulnerable situation. In May 1969, Farrell was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of 15 to 25 years in state prison. According to a report provided to us by the Worcester Police Department, since we shared Phyllis Ann's story earlier this season, by 1977, Farrell had been granted parole. In October 1977, Farrell was arrested again, this time for an assault and battery and kidnapping, after offering a woman a ride home and then holding her in his car against her will and physically abusing her. Following another arrest in 1983, Farrell was returned to prison to resume his concurrent sentence of 15 to 25 years in state prison. However, by 1987, Farrell was granted parole again, and he continued his career as a bus driver. He died in early 2022. Farrell hunted and assaulted women for decades in Worcester, and we plan to do a full episode on him in a later season of Unsolved Worcester. Thank you for listening. I'm Dan Yeager. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please consider clicking the like button for us. And if you subscribe, the next episodes will show up in your feed. Click the bell on the right, and you'll get a notification of when the next episode is ready. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, please leave them in the comments below. We do read all of them and respond to as many as we can. Anyone with information about the murders of Sonia, Blanco, or Evelyn Cruz are asked to contact the Worcester Police Detective Bureau at 508-799-8651 or send an anonymous text to 274-637. Write TIP WPD and your message, or send an anonymous web-based message at worcesterma.gov/police. Come back on Thursday as Season 2 of Unsolved Worcester continues with the unsolved murder of cab driver Vincent Martin, killed on December 28, 1995, in front of his Millbury Street apartment. Be sure to visit Unsolved Worcester on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Unsolved Worcester. Listen to all episodes for free at unsolvedworcester.com and podcast streaming platforms including Spotify, iTunes, and more. Special thanks to Worcester Public Library, the Worcester Police Department, the City of Worcester, Ron Scott at New England Sky Picks, and our sponsors for making this possible. The Unsolved Worcester podcast music is provided by Tom LaBelzik of the Worcester Jazz Collective. This episode of Unsolved Worcester is written and produced by Pat Sargent. Drone footage provided by New England Sky Picks. Videography and editing by Colin Turner. Victim images are courtesy of the Worcester Police Department. Sponsorship information announcer Chandler Walsh. Be sure to check out the video for this episode with exclusive aerial views and more on our Unsolved Worcester YouTube page. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss another episode. Click the notification button to get alerts when the new episodes of Unsolved Worcester drop. This program is supported in part by a grant from the Worcester Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. To find out more about how National Endowment for the Arts grants impact individuals and communities, visit www.arts.gov.